Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for taking the time to come to the seminar, and thank you to PermafrostNet for hosting me. Today I'm going to present some of my preliminary results from my PhD research, which I am doing under the co-supervision of Melissa Lafreniere and Scott Lamoureux, and in very close collaboration with Dr. Steve Coquel. So before I begin, I thought I would take a moment to introduce myself and my research background. I did my Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Science at York University. My honors thesis is really what introduced me to Arctic research. I spent 2 summers in Churchill, Manitoba, studying the influence of benthic algae on carbon dioxide exchange from shallow tundra ponds in the Hudson's Bay lowlands. After my BSc, I went on to do an MSc at the University of Victoria, and this was with the Water Climate Impacts Research Centre. This is what brought me to Inuvik. For my MSc research, I studied the impacts of retrogressive thaw slumping on the hydrology and geochemistry of shallow tundra lakes in the upland region east of Inuvik. And in the last year of my MSc, I did an NSERC Northern Research internship with the Aurora Research Institute and Dr. Steve Coquel, also in Inuvik. And this was based out of the Western Arctic Research Center. After my internship, I was hired on at Wark and have been here ever since. My main responsibility at Wark has been to develop and manage our permafrost and water quality research programs. And this is really what motivated me to pursue a PhD. The concept of my PhD really stems from research that's ongoing at ARI. So I'd like to take a moment to thank ARI for supporting me through this process. Okay, so the 3 study rivers that I'm going to be talking about today are located in the Beaufort Delta region of the Northwest Territories. This is a region of continuous permafrost, whereby the permafrost is characteristically very ice-rich. Massive ice is common in this area. This includes remnants of glacial ice, as well as ice wedge ice. Spatial variability in the volumetric ice content of the permafrost in this region is highly variable, depending on the glacial history of the terrain, vegetation distribution, as well as ground temperature. The thawing of massive ice has and continues to dramatically alter the landscape. This includes paraglacial terrain, such as high-centered polygonal terrain. An example of this can be seen in picture A, and mass wasting. An example of this can be seen in picture B. Additionally, increasing air and ground temperature has caused thermal perturbation to the permafrost. Physical disturbances to the permafrost, however, mass wasting in particular, have set the context for the vast majority of water quality studies in the region. Few studies have focused on streams and rivers not impacted by physical disturbances to the permafrost. So the 3 study catchments that I'm looking at fall along a south to north gradient and consequently exhibit variable landscape and permafrost conditions. To the south, number 1 and 2 are Caribou Creek and Rengleng River. They're situated approximately 100 kilometers south of Inuvik, below treeline, and are headwaters for the Mackenzie River, which discharges into the Beaufort Sea. Although not formally located in the Gwich'in settlement area, Rengleng River has been classified as a special protected area. These 2 rivers were selected because they have recently started flowing over the winter. This is unique for this area because most small headwater catchments stop flowing in winter. And until approximately 2009, this was also the case for Rengleng River and Caribou Creek. In this region, it's been well documented that warmer air and ground temperatures associated with contemporary climate change have led to top-down permafrost thaw, or active layer thickening. The emergence of winter discharge suggests that top-down permafrost thaw has increased the connectivity of the main river channel with groundwater flow pathways. In particular, groundwater flow through perennial thaw layers, or talic zones, is likely acting as a conduit for groundwater flow. The 3rd river, or minor river, is very different from the first 2. It's situated north of Rengleng River and Caribou Creek. In contrast with the previous 2 watersheds, the majority of the catchment falls beyond treeline. Furthermore, Minor River does not fall within the Mackenzie Delta basin. Rather, it flows into Kigaluk Channel and Amariak, also known as Husky Lakes. Amariak is a particularly important site to the Nunavut, who have classified this as a special protected area. Also, the Minor River does not flow over the winter months. In fact, this catchment was selected because it is strongly impacted by mass wasting or physical disturbances to the permafrost. The Minor River watershed approaches the limit of the Laurentide ice sheet. Glacier margins such as this are very rich in massive ice, and these large volumes of massive ice in this region are often only protected by a very thin overburden layer or active layer, making them very susceptible to mass wasting. There's a strong body of research investigating the effects of thaw slumping on stream and river chemistry. This research, however, is predominantly based out of the Peel Plateau region, which is located just here where I'm circling. The landscape conditions in the Minor River catchment are quite different than the Peel Plateau. In particular, the Minor River is fed by numerous organic-rich tributary streams. So a goal of this study is to not only investigate the impacts of mass wasting on the Minor River, but to compare and contrast our results with the work coming out of the Peel Plateau region. I've included a video here, just of the Minor River. I'll apologize for the angle, but this was a particularly difficult site to get into. Just play it here. So this is a mega slump that has partially blocked the channel, forcing the river to cut into the bank on the opposite side. Due to this blockage, the river flows quite quickly in this section of the river, mobilizing large quantities of sediment. And if you were to look at the river on Google Earth, which is actually, well, we saw it from a helicopter, but you can also see it in Google Earth, you would see a notable change in the sediment concentration of the river after this particular event. So there are a number of factors that control the response of water quality to permafrost thaw. For this reason, the impacts of permafrost thaw on aquatic systems can be highly variable across permafrost landscapes. To better understand this variability, I'm hoping to build on previous research done in the Western Arctic region to characterize the water chemistry of streams and rivers across different landscapes. In particular, I'm referring to the work of Scott Zolkos and Suzanne Tank. So fluvial chemistry is driven by landscape runoff, as well as in-stream biological processes, precipitation, and tributary streams. The chemistry of landscape runoff is controlled by the flow pathway itself, so whether the water flows over top on the surface or near the surface, or whether it flows in the ground. And groundwater flow can either happen above the permafrost or below the permafrost. In addition to this, the chemistry of landscape runoff is driven by permafrost conditions. So this is the nature of thermokarst or magnitude of thermokarst. It can be driven by terrain conditions, so superficial geology, soil organic content, relief, or hydrologic connectivity. And it can also be driven by climatic conditions, and this would be the magnitude of spring snowmelt or extreme rainfall events. So this really speaks to how variable the response of fluvial chemistry can be to permafrost thaw. So in today's presentation, I'm going to focus on two of the themes of my PhD research. In theme one, I compare and contrast the seasonal response of water quality to the emergence of winter stream flow in two organic-rich Arctic rivers not influenced by mass wasting. So this would be Rengleng River and Caribou Creek. And in the second theme, I investigate the cumulative effects of organic-rich peatland tributary streams and mass wasting on the chemistry of the Minor River. So the first data set I'm going to discuss is the Rengleng River and Caribou Creek data set. For this theme, there were three broad objectives. The first was to examine seasonal variability in the water chemistry of Rengleng River and Caribou Creek, and this was for the period of record. So for my PhD, I sampled Rengleng River and Caribou Creek in 2021, and there was also data from 2019 and 2020 that was made available from the Aurora Research Institute. I also did the sampling, but not as a PhD student. And then for the second objective, I want to examine how water quality responds to winter discharge, spring snowmelt, and summer rainfall. And to do this, I utilize historical discharge data available from the Water Survey of Canada, as well as historical climate data that's made available by Environment and Climate Change Canada. And then finally, I'm looking to characterize the terrain and permafrost conditions in the Rengleng River and Caribou Creek watersheds in order to explain the water quality response of each river network. So these two figures plot the superficial geology for Caribou Creek and Rengleng River. Caribou Creek is indicated by letter A, and Rengleng River is indicated by letter B. The figure on the left represents the primary genetic units, and the figure on the right represents the secondary genetic units. Note that the secondary genetic units were not available for the northern half of Caribou Creek. This is because I stitched together two data sets, and the second data set wasn't quite as detailed as the first one. The superficial geology layer for this figure was obtained from the Geological Survey of Canada, and the watersheds were delineated using the Arctic Digital Elevation Model obtained from Natural Resources Canada. For both catchments, about 25 to 39% of the contributing landscape is classified as organic. Aside from organic material, the superficial material in Rengleng River is predominantly glacial till, and this is associated with a moraine plain, a rolling moraine, or a drumlinoid moraine type terrain, whereby the glacial till can be very thick. By contrast, Caribou Creek has glacial till, but this is mainly associated with the moraine veneer, which suggests that the glacial till can be very thin in some places and overlie bedrock, which kind of speaks to what you see when you're in the catchment itself. So these figures represent the permafrost conditions in the catchment. So they plot specifically the paraglacial features. This base layer was obtained from the NWT Thermokarst Mapping Collective, which is a collaborative project between the Aurora Research Institute and the Northwest Territories Geological Survey, whereby Sentinel satellite imagery is used to map the distribution and abundance of paraglacial and mass wasting features at a 7.5 kilometer pixel scale. On the left, we can see the organic terrain physiography. So this is really the presence or absence of paraglacial features that are associated with organic terrain in these 7.5 kilometer pixel cells. And what you can see is that for every pixel cell, or most every pixel cell in both of these catchments, we saw either pattern ponding or polygonal terrain, or both. What this doesn't tell us is the actual percent coverage of these features. So to do that, I looked at another layer, which looked at the percentage polygonal terrain cover. And you can see that for most of Rengleng River, although polygonal terrain was present, it was present in relatively low amounts, so less than 10% of each pixel cell was covered. And then in the final one, we look at the level of degradation associated with organic terrain. And as we expected in this region, the polygonal terrain is experiencing relatively low amounts of degradation, and that's in line with literature, which says that polygonal terrain in this region is actually quasi-stable. So I'm going to move on to the chemistry. So the water quality sampling was co-located with a Water Survey of Canada gauging station. So in the top figure, we can see discharge, which is in black. Now, you might wonder why I included this in the figure. And I think this is to articulate that although discharge is measured continuously at this site, this was the only data that was available for this time period. And I think this is a challenge that we face in a lot of Arctic sites, river sites, stream and river sites, is that sometimes data isn't consistent or available. And that's certainly something we have to work on moving forward. We can see that in the red line is temperature, and in the blue bars represent total daily precipitation. And this was measured in Nunavik at a weather station owned and operated by Environment and Climate Change Canada. In the bottom figure, the dark brown represents total suspended solids, black represents conductivity, and light brown represents total dissolved salts. So in 2021, interestingly, flow actually ceased in late winter, so between January 14th to April 13th. And that means that the flow measured at the gauging station stopped. There was actually no flow through the channel. However, visual observations at Caribou Creek indicate that there was still groundwater flow onto the ice. So these were accounts made by a community member that has a cabin on Caribou Creek. They indicated that water would flow over top of the ice and then freeze back. And I actually took a picture of the ice here. It may be hard to see in this photo, but when you look at the whole river, it was pretty notable that the surface ice was very dark or tea-colored, which could be indicative of a groundwater seepage kind of going out and onto the Caribou Creek. However, this didn't contribute to flow through the channel. Total suspended solids are generally low in Caribou Creek as compared with total dissolved solutes. At the onset of spring snowmelt, however, total dissolved solute concentrations decreased somewhat and total suspended solid concentrations increased. And what this suggests to us is that we were experiencing at that time a dilution of total dissolved solutes and a mobilization of surficial material, which is indicative of surface flow. So when the active layer is still frozen, snowmelt waters typically just flows at the surface or near the surface, and this is associated with the mobilization of suspended material or solid material, and not as much the mobilization of solutes or dissolved material. As the summer thaw period progressed and the active layer thickened, we saw an increase in the importance of subsurface flow, and this was reflected in the chemistry. So there was a steep increase in conductivity and total dissolved solute concentrations, and a decrease in total suspended solid concentrations, which decreased to close to zero. So Rengleng River, we did see flow through the channel in winter. This was generally through two layers of ice. So there was an ice layer on the bottom and then an ice layer on the top, and then there was flow through the middle. So we do have discharge measurements for the winter period. However, there are some gaps, and I suspect this is associated with the challenges of measuring discharge between those two layers. What we saw over the winter period is a very steep increase in conductivity and total dissolved solute concentrations, which is reflective of lateral flow through talc zones, which are typically dominated by mineral soil. At the onset of spring snowmelt, we saw a steep decrease, or a very pronounced decrease, in total dissolved solute concentrations and conductivity, and an increase in total suspended solid concentrations, which, like Caribou Creek, is indicative of surface flow. And then as the summer thaw progresses, we see an increase in that conductivity and total dissolved solute concentrations, and a decrease to almost zero of total suspended solids, which of course is associated with subsurface flow through the active layer. So to try and tease out what was happening a little bit more, we wanted to look at the composition of the water quality or the water samples. And to do this, we used Piper diagrams. So these Piper diagrams plot the relative concentrations in percent milliequivalents per liter of the major ions or the mineral ions in the water samples from Caribou Creek and Rengleng River. This is for all 3 years, so 2019, 2020, and 21, and across all seasons. As the seasons progress from winter to fall, the colors progress from light blue to dark green. So what we like to use these diagrams for is to visualize what type of weathering is driving water chemistry. If the dots fall in this zone, at least for this region, if the dots fall in this zone, so on the kind of upper left here, weathering is driven by carbonate weathering. And this is samples that contain high proportions of calcium and magnesium. If the samples fall in the left corner, we have high proportions of carbonate and bicarbonate, as well as high proportions of calcium and magnesium, which suggests carbonate weathering driven by carbonic acid. And if you have dots that fall in this top corner, we have higher proportions of sulfate and chlorine and low proportions of carbonate and bicarbonate, which suggests carbonate weathering driven by sulfuric acid. So what we can see is that for Rengleng River, the dots kind of fall in close to the bottom left corner, which indicates that carbonate weathering is driven by a mixture of carbonic acid and sulfuric acid year-round, but predominantly carbonic acid. Interestingly, in Caribou Creek, there seems to be a seasonal trend. So in spring and winter, we can see that carbonate weathering is driven by carbonic acid, similar to Rengleng River. But as the season progresses, sulfate and chlorine become more dominant, which could be indicative of deeper subsurface flow, whereby the groundwater flow has less interaction with carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So in addition to mineral ion composition, we wanted to look at dissolved organic carbon to ascertain where this groundwater flow is coming from and what implications it had for chemistry. we expected to see, or I expected to see, a decrease in dissolved organic carbon over the winter period. And this would be associated with groundwater flow through talc zones, which, as I mentioned previously, are typically more dominated by mineral soil, at least I thought they were. And mineral soil typically has a lower carbon content. In contrast, with what I expected to see, we saw a steep increase in dissolved organic carbon. This was particularly true for Rengleng River. And we also saw that dissolved organic carbon was elevated during the spring melt period, which is what we would expect to see. As the summer months progressed, DOC decreased, which is also what we expect to see as water flow kind of migrates from the top layer to deeper in the active layer, which is more mineral soil. In addition to DOC concentration, we looked at DOC age. And this was, again, to try and ascertain where this carbon was coming from. And what we found was very interesting. So the samples in Rengleng River, which did flow over the winter period, the carbon that we found was aged. And this was also true for our late summer sample. So this could be indicative of groundwater flow through recently thawed permafrost or a deeper active layer talc flow. So what does this mean, really? So firstly, I just want to highlight that this is an example of how water chemistry can be used to detect permafrost changes that are not visible from the surface. And what we saw was that water chemistry suggests that winter discharge is associated with deeper flow or increasing active layer thicknesses and potentially or likely talc development. And that this winter discharge could increase solute and aged DOC loads to the Mackenzie River. We also saw that winter discharge varied annually, and this is likely dependent on climatic conditions. So although Caribou Creek does flow in the winter some years, it didn't flow in 2021, which was interesting. And then finally, more intense spring snowmelt and summer rainfall periods could increase total suspended solid and DOC loads to the Mackenzie River. In terms of recommendations for future research and monitoring efforts, one of our major challenges was the availability and reliability of river discharge data. So it would be, I think, a priority to increase that availability and reliability so that we can have more robust analysis of climatic controls on river discharge and winter and water chemistry. It would also be interesting to look at not just 1 year of data, but to look at multi-year and seasonal trends in water chemistry at these two sites, and to consistently include winter chemistry in our analyses. And then finally, to include other headwater streams or rivers in the region. So I just wanted to mention that these are not the only two rivers that have started flowing in winter in recent years. And so it would be interesting to expand our monitoring and look at additional streams and rivers. So following that, I wanted to move on to the minor river data set. So this was theme 2. And just as a quick reminder, the purpose of this theme was to investigate the cumulative effects of organic rich peatland tributary streams and mass wasting on the chemistry of the minor river. So we wanted to achieve this purpose with two broad objectives. The first was to examine the water chemistry, so a number of water chemistry parameters, before and after each retrogressive thaw slump that fell on the minor river. And then second, to delineate and characterize the contributing catchment using terrain and permafrost conditions in order to explain spatial variability in the water quality response of the minor river to mass wasting. So similar to Rengleng River and Caribou Creek, I wanted to look at the superficial geology of minor river. I used 2 superficial geology data sets to obtain coverage of the minor river watershed. Note that this watershed has been delineated to the last sampling location, which is almost the whole catchment, but not entirely the whole catchment, and is located near the outlet of the river to Kigalik Channel. So these superficial geology data sets did not include secondary genetic units, Additionally, the data set in the northern half was mapped at a much lower resolution and did not account for organic deposits. So unfortunately, this map likely underrepresents the amount of organic material in the catchment. Based on this data, the predominant superficial geology is hummocky moraine, moraine plain, and glacial till blanket. So in contrast with Caribou Creek to the south, this indicates that there is a thick layer of glacial till spanning this watershed, much like Rengleng River. I also wanted to look at the permafrost conditions and get a better sense of the distribution and physiography of the organic terrain in the catchment. So again, I turned to the NWT Thermokarst Mapping Collective. As I mentioned earlier, they use sentinel satellite imagery to map the distribution and abundance of paraglacial and mass wasting features at a 7.5 kilometer pixel scale. Similar to Rengleng River and Caribou Creek, the predominant organic terrain physiography in this catchment was polygonal terrain and pattern ponding. And interestingly, it was present in slightly higher amounts. So although most of the catchment polygonal terrain cover was less than 10%, there are some areas of the catchment where we see between 10% and 33%, which matches our visual observations in the field. And then finally, I wanted to look at level of degradation. And also similar to Rengleng River and Caribou Creek, the polygonal terrain in Minor River is experiencing low levels of degradation. I also plotted here the location of mass wasting features along the main channel. So in 2022, I did an aerial survey with Alice Wilson from the Northwest Territories Geological Survey. And we cataloged all of the mass wasting features that were fully connected to the main river channel. There were 3 of these that were not only connected to the main river channel, but also had debris tongues that expanded and partially blocked the channel. So here's the data set. So in 2022, we wanted to look at the difference in total suspended solid concentrations before and after each thaw slump feature. The concentration of total suspended solids before the thaw slump is in black, and the total suspended solid concentrations after the thaw slump is in kind of this light pink color. And you can see that for 3 sites, there was a very pronounced change in total suspended solid concentrations before and after each thaw slump. What I also found interesting is that the sediment concentrations were very elevated after S7 and then decreased to almost the same level as before S7, and then also elevated after S6. They remain somewhat elevated, but there is definitely a decrease in sediment concentrations over the river channel, and that's reflective of what we observed in the field. And so Minor River, there are a lot of sediment banks on either the bottom or the side of the river, which suggests that the sediment concentrations from these thaw slumps are often exceeding the carrying capacity of the river. And so they get deposited on the bottom or the side and likely get remobilized during periods of high discharge, during spring snowmelt or during high rainfall periods. I've included photos of these thaw slumps on the side here. So this is S7. This is the first thaw slump along the river channel. This is S6, so this is the mega slump, and that's the slump that I provided a video of. And then finally, this is S8. It's actually the last active thaw slump that we cataloged along the Minor River. So in 2023, we targeted these 3 sites. The reason for this was this allowed us to sample more over the thaw period. Minor River was fairly remote, so we can only access the site by helicopter, and we can't actually travel on the river by boat. So we had to kind of stop at each site with the helicopter. So we reduced our sampling to 3, and we sampled in every month between June and September. And we wanted to look at not only the change in sediment concentrations, but also the change in other parameters that could be associated with mineral weathering or the weathering of organic material. And so much like 2022, we saw elevated sediment concentrations after each thaw slump with those large debris tongues. And there's a lot of variability in the amount of sediment concentrations that we measured. The lower amounts were typically associated with June or the post-spring snowmelt period, and these very high amounts are associated with early August. For anyone who was in the Western Arctic, you'll probably remember that we had a really dry summer this year, and in early August, I think we'd gone almost 6 weeks without rainfall. And that, as a result, we got very concentrated river samples. We found that that something was also associated with elevated concentrations of total nitrogen and total phosphorus, which could be indicative of the mobilization of particulate organic material, as well as the concentration of particulate trace metals, in particular aluminum, iron, barium, manganese, and strontium. Of those, there was a strong positive correlation between total suspended solid concentrations and aluminum, iron, and phosphorus in particular. So in the Peel Plateau region, studies have demonstrated that thaw slumping can actually lead to a decrease in dissolved organic carbon. This is driven by the adsorption of dissolved organic carbon to mineral sediment. As the Minor River is fed by numerous organic-rich tributary streams, we wanted to see how total suspended solids from mass wasting interact with carbon-rich water. We did observe a decrease in DOC concentrations following the 3 mass wasting features. However, the response was quite small, and when we looked at the correlation between total suspended sediment and DOC, there was a very weak negative correlation. So I think understanding why we are not seeing a strong response in the Minor River is an important next step. And then also because monitoring the effects of mass wasting on DOC is important because it influences dissolved metals as well as contaminants, for example, mercury. So the key findings from this theme are that, yes, mass wasting is increasing sediment loading to the Minor River. However, the downstream impacts of thaw slumping are determined by the physical characteristics of the thaw slump, as well as river discharge. River discharge in particular is limiting sediment transport downstream. Sediment loads are a source of particulate organic material and trace metals, and that the relationship between these sediment loads drive the mass wasting and dissolved organic carbon is unclear. So in terms of future research and monitoring, because of course this is kind of preliminary data analysis, I would like to examine the relationship between mass wasting and dissolved organic carbon further. As I mentioned, this has implications for dissolved metals and contaminants. I would also like to utilize enrichment factors to quantify the impacts of mass wasting on particulate organic material and trace metals. It would be really interesting as well to look at fluxes. We've had some challenges quantifying discharge through the Minor River, mainly due to the availability of the right equipment that we can use because it can be fairly deep and wide in a lot of sections. But I'm hoping this summer we can start to measure discharge and start looking at fluxes of sediment along the river and perhaps incorporate additional sites. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you to the Environment and Natural Resources Division of the Government of the Northwest Territories, who analyzed our water samples, as well as the Andre E. Lalonde AMS laboratory that provided the DOC age data. I'd also like to thank Alice Wilson from the Northwest Territories Geological Survey, and Ryan McLeod and Greg Elias from the Aurora Research Institute, who assisted with fieldwork, and of course my funding, which came from the NSERC Permafrost Network of Canada, the National Science and Engineering Research Council, the Weston Family Foundation, and Polar Continental Shelf.
Excellent, Erika. Thank you very much. Fantastic presentation. I wonder if anyone has any questions. I have one thing that I'd love to ask you, Erika.
Mm-hmm.
How challenging would it be because I see how much analysis you've done and how much work you've done. How hard would it be to have some degree of sort of community monitoring, or maybe sort of less expertise analysis of water, so that, you know, more people would be able to look at their local sort of watersheds and maybe do some sort of monitoring?
Well, the Inuvi Alouette in particular, just I'm only mentioning this because I'm aware of their program. I'm sure the Gwich'in Tribal Council's also doing some amazing things. But I have been speaking to the Inuvi Alouette Regional Council, who has an amazing research division, and they actually acquired a mobile lab where they're able to analyze water samples in this mobile lab. Um, and what they're doing is they're targeting rivers, streams and rivers that are significant to Inuvialuit people, and they have monitors, Inuvialuit monitors that are trained to go out and collect these samples. And then they analyze them in their mobile lab. And I have been speaking to them, and they're interested in participating in the minor river sampling. And that would certainly make life a lot easier. But I think for minor river, manpower isn't our limiting factor. It's the site itself. It's very hard to access. And we initially thought we could get dropped off at the bottom of the river and take a boat up it the first year. And I think Ryan and I were in the field for 14 hours that day, and we probably were in the boat for like 10 minutes because we were just carrying the boat over these like sediment banks. So yeah, it's really hard to access. But yes, I think that engagement of local people and training of local people has been a priority for us, and collaboration with the local Indigenous organizations for sure.
How many people and how much the population that just affected by this water quality, and how many people just feel just being affected by this research? I mean, if we want to just put this research to that area, how many people, for example, just using the water, and how much is the population that just affected by the water quality under drinking?
What's the population that's affected by these mass wasting features? Yeah, no, that's a really good question, because Minor River, it flows into Husky Lakes. And as I mentioned, Husky Lakes is a special protected area, and not just the lakes itself, but the entire watershed is used for hunting and fishing and trapping. And a lot of people travel overland to Husky Lakes, and they fish in Husky Lakes. And most Inuvialuit have a camp on Husky Lakes. So the implications of these mass wasting features along not only Minor River, but all the rivers that flow into Husky Lakes could have implications for traditional hunting and fishing up here. I don't know the specific population. Population of Inuvik is about 2,500 to 3,000. And yeah, the Inuvialuit make up a significant percentage of that. So yeah, kind of getting a handle on how this is impacting Husky Lakes is important, and definitely priority number one here.
Great, thanks, Erika. I guess, I have a bunch of questions that come to mind now that you explain the relationship to Husky Lakes. So first of all, what has anybody been looking at the fish and the changes in the metals and contaminants in the fish there?
Yeah, there have been I think the Inuvialuit are very hesitant to allow researchers to actually do work in Husky Lakes, but I do know there's a fish monitoring program that's led by the Fisheries Joint Management Committee that I think has, at least in the past, included Husky Lakes. And that's where local hunters and trappers who are fishing anyways will measure like the length and the health of the fish, and then collect samples, which are then sent. And I know that they've looked at mercury in fish in Husky Lakes, but that was quite a while ago. So Yeah, I think if Fisheries Joint Management Committee is likely doing the ongoing fish monitoring, because in terms of researchers going in to do work, I think that they would be pretty hesitant to approve that.
Yeah. Okay. And I guess a related question is like if you had to suggest to say like a community, or an organization, what would be something that they could easily monitor sort of to detect the stuff we don't see happening at the surface, or that they may not be to detect where there might be thaw or where there might be disturbances upstream. Maybe they're small and not as visible as these massive slumps or mega slumps, but what would you suggest would be sort of a key variable for communities to maybe keep an eye on?
I think like an easy grab is like turbidity. Because there are sensors that measure turbidity that you can install, and then you don't have to go visit the sites all the time. You could just download the data, maybe like at the end of the season. And then if you saw a response, then maybe you could try and pursue further analyses of water samples at the sites that you were seeing impacts.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think turbidity is key. Is that from a lot of the work we've done in the high Arctic, we see, and also related to fish, is that where we see turbidity increase, that's where we see all the contaminants increase. And yeah, so okay, great, thanks. That was great to see all that.
I see Hussein has posted a question in the chat, so I can ask on his behalf. He says, you mentioned about trace metal enrichment. Do these minerals enrichment because of mass wasting or just because there is some in situ deposit of those minerals there?
I think so. The samples were collected fairly close to each other, the before and after. So we collected before the impact of the slump and after the impact of the slump. So there wasn't a lot of time for anything other than the slump to impact the water sample. At least that was the logic of that design. So I'm fairly certain that the particulate trace metals that we were seeing can almost directly be related to the sediment loading from the thaw slump. It's a little more challenging to determine the enrichment downstream because all this sediment is being loaded into the river, but not all of it is being carried just because it's a very slow meandering river with low discharge. And so that's going to be a little more puzzling to do to figure that out. But yes, I do think that the enrichment by particulate trace metals can be related directly to mass wasting.
I see there's another question in the chat. From the photos and general location in the Mackenzie Basin, it seems that these study basins are relatively flat. In basins with similar permafrost extent but steeper terrain, how would you expect mass wasting, size or frequency, and channel sediment loads, or water chemistry, impacts to differ?
That's a great question. So as I mentioned in our presentation, there's a lot of work being done in the Peel Plateau, which you're right, Minor River is very flat-ish. Yeah, it's flat. So it's a very slow meandering river, whereas in the Peel Plateau, it's very high relief. And so we see a lot more mobilization of sediment from these thaw slumps to downstream aquatic systems, and then ultimately to the Peel River and the Mackenzie. So yes, terrain relief, it would directly affect the sediment loading to rivers and then in turn the water chemistry. In terms of size and frequency, we do see a lot of thaw slumping along the main channel of the Minor River because it's pretty deeply incised. So although it's a kind of a low relief terrain in the catchment, the channel itself has steeper banks. And that could be why we're seeing a lot of thaw slumping along the channel. Whereas in the catchment itself, there are not as many thaw slumps that don't form on channels or lakes. Whereas, yeah, in the Peel Plateau and the Willow River catchment, you have these very high relief areas where you're seeing tons of thaw slumps. So yeah, very, very big difference in the size and frequency of the thaw slumps.
So thank you very much, Erika. It was a delight to have you present our latest seminar, and thank you very much.
Thank you.